Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Tonight, a panel featuring medical, legal, and social psychology experts will dig into the risky business of talking politics at work. To begin, please join me in welcoming to the stage Aman Kidwai, Newsweek's Workplaces editor.
Hello, everyone. My sincere thanks to everyone in this room for attending, and thanks to those watching via live stream, and thank you to SHRM for sponsoring this event this evening. Here at Newsweek, we believe that civil, good faith debate is in the public interest, and we welcome diverse views and voices to the search for common ground. That's in our mission statements. It's in something we work to achieve every day. That's why we're here to talk about civility at work and how to maintain a respectful workplace culture amid rising political tension and debate. At its core, this is about getting along, playing nice with others. Some would say kindergarten stuff. At a much deeper level, for business leaders, it's about organizational behavior, rising political polarization, changes in how we consume information, and the challenge of staying productive when distractions are one smartphone notification away. Later this evening, you're going to see a video presentation of the Newsweek's Stubblefield Civility Awards. But first, to get tonight's program started, please welcome to the stage Jim Link, Chief Human Resources Officer at SHRM, the world's largest professional network for HR leaders, and our sponsor for this evening.
Well, hello, everyone. Aman, thank you so much for that kind introduction. My name is Jim Link, and it is certainly a privilege to be here with you this evening to talk about this very important topic. I want to thank Newsweek for highlighting this crucial element and this crucial idea that civility and inclusion are connected together in such a way, and that we have the power to change that narrative and to make a difference in our world. You know, because as a company at SHRM, we believe that this entire phrase of being better and having better workplaces, we believe leads to greater outcomes for everyone. So earlier this year, you all may know that at SHRM, we came up with this little idea to start talking about civility. Now, we did not come up with this on our own. We have more than 340,000 members around the world. And what those members started to tell us, they didn't really call it civility, but what they really started talking about was these differences that they were seeing in work actions and the way things were happening in the workplace. So we began to dig into that and research that a little bit, and that became known as civility. We actually launched this as a campaign for us to start thinking about and recognizing at South by Southwest down in Austin, Texas, in March of this year. We began by surveying workers and employers to really monitor what we think of as incivility in society. And what we found is a picture that's not a pretty one to paint. More than half of U.S. workers believe our society is uncivil. And our workplaces are certainly not exempt from this trend that we're seeing. In fact, U.S. workers experience 223 million acts of incivility per day. 223 million per day. And of course, and certainly as of late, the majority of those stem from political divisions and political discourse. Our research further shows that 71% of U.S. workers have had a polarizing political or controversial conversation at work, and 81% of employers themselves are concerned about how they are going to manage these divisive political opinions and beliefs. Now, we thought that once the election was over, that tide might change a little bit, that it actually might start to ebb somewhat. But our ongoing research, unfortunately, at SHRM tells us something a little bit different. And what that research tells us is, in fact, that over the course of the year, incivility has increased, and by a whopping number of 30% since we began tracking this in the first quarter of 2024. Now, workers don't believe that the workplaces are providing the cover that they need. In 2024, 21% of workers felt that their workplaces were generally ineffective at promoting civility and civil discourse. This incivility is obviously costing us. It impacts workers' well-being, their mental health, their belonging, their performance, and it affects business outcomes as well, such as employee engagement and retention, as well as just about every other business measure that you can possibly measure. We can't afford to wait for incivility to go away on its own. The data shows us workplace incivility is perhaps even harming our broader economic capabilities. We know this because this collective data reveals that we could be suffering up to a daily loss of $2.7 billion due to reduced productivity and absenteeism. So can we say that incivility is actually potentially harming America's GDP? Perhaps. We don't know the answer just yet, but it's those types of numbers and those types of outcomes that certainly will get the attention of business leaders. So these numbers are staggering, but they're not insurmountable. As a matter of fact, the first time I saw them, I thought we'd just done the research wrong. I'm like, what? Can this possibly be the case? But I believe there's hope. And we don't have to look too far, because the source of my hope, the source that I believe is the place where we want to be, is in our workplaces. Here is where we see innovation, where we see ingenuity, where we see problem solving. In those workplaces, we face complex problems every day, just like this one, and we've learned over the years how to solve them. This one is no different. I believe in the power of workplace collaboration to drive change and find solutions to make all of us better. Imagine a workplace where every opinion is an opportunity and every conversation is a catalyst for civility. Creating workplaces we believe in requires durable, lifelong skills, such as empathy, respect, and understanding. If we simply wait for this fire to burn itself out, it won't. The cost of business will be catastrophic, and we will all, unfortunately, pay the price. So it's why conversations like the one we're about to have up here today is important, crucial, and vital. But we also know that it's not just those of us who recognize this issue, it's those folks who are in the workplaces every day who are facing these types of issues. We will totally never agree on anything. We've proven that time and time again. But we can decide to treat each other and our ideas with empathy and respect. There are 161 million people working in this country every day. 161 million. They each bring their own ideas and their own perspectives. This diversity is what drives innovation forward. I believe that we must have workplaces that protect our inclusive culture, and I further believe that civility gives inclusion a chance. Thank you again for allowing me to be here this evening and for your commitment to fostering inclusion and civility in all of our respective workplaces. Let's work together to all create workplaces in which we can believe. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jim, for getting us started. Now, to begin our panel discussion on how to foster and maintain civility in the workplace, we're excited to introduce a group of experts who can speak to employee well-being, workplace culture and communication, and psychology. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. First, we have Steve Paskoff, President and CEO of ELI. Next, Gabriella Rosen-Kellerman, Chief Innovation Officer at BetterUp. Next up, Kurt Gray, Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill. And Michael Franklin, Executive Director of Speechwriters of Color. All right, wonderful. You guys can all take a seat. We're going to start with a quick kind of Jeopardy-style intro with each of our panelists. Just talk a little bit about your background, what is it that you do exactly, and why do you care about this topic? Steve, you want to start us off? Tell us about ELI and what you do there.
Thank you. ELI is a consulting firm with learning elements. We've been in business since 1986. I was originally an investigator, trial attorney for the EEOC, and partner in a management law firm. Our core work is what we call civil treatment, and the whole idea is to help organizations address legal issues, but also issues that are not necessarily legal, but affect behavior and outcomes. That's what we do, and we're trying to build cultures which activate values that reflect the essence of what the organization wants to be and how its key human resource asset, its people, are treated.
And why does this topic matter to you and your organization?
It matters because it affects all of our lives. Jim mentioned the cost of billions of dollars. What we do is like to talk about what that means in daily life. In healthcare, and it could affect treatment and surgery. In nuclear power, it can cause people who won't speak up and don't trust one another. It can affect people's lives, existence, safety, innovation, security, and that's where those billions of dollars are coming from. But the real cost is the harm that incivility, as it's defined, and we'll talk about that, can cause.
Excellent, thank you. So Gabrielle, why don't you tell us a little bit about BetterUp and what you do there?
Great, I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at BetterUp. We are a technology platform that supports organizational transformation through human and AI coaching. I run BetterUp Labs, which is a first of its kind interdisciplinary behavioral science research lab. We are studying the inner lives of whole person professionals around the globe. And part of our charter is to understand the most urgent concerns of organizational leaders as they emerge from the workforce. Political polarization has been a growing concern for our CEO and CHRO partners, particularly over the last few years. But unfortunately, there has not been an evidence base from which they can draw to inform effective responses. So about 6 months ago, our lab set out to both collect and mine our own data across hundreds of thousands of workers around the globe, studying what's happening around political polarization at work, how much it's costing, what's making it better, what's making it worse, and then to apply that data, provide that data to our partners to close that evidence gap.
Excellent. And you already covered kind of why the topic matters, so I'll just go on then to Kurt. Kurt, tell us a little bit about what you work on.
Yeah, so I'm a professor. I study how people make sense of the minds of others. I direct the Deepest Beliefs Lab at the University of North Carolina and a Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. So I study things like religion, politics, morality, things that most people try to avoid at the holiday table. But you know, we're all incredibly interested about these things, and so it's hard not to be interested in studying them. In terms of why this matters, I mean, it's been said before, it matters for America, it matters for our relationships. I myself have family members who have very different opinions on politics than, let's say, my very progressive colleagues, very different reactions after the election. And so I'm interested in that, but also I'm interested in just the academic question of like, how can we bridge this gap between two minds? Someone who believes something so strongly and someone who believes the opposite. And so how do we make that happen?
Excellent. And then Michael, why don't you take us home? Tell us a little about your work at Speechwriters of Color and why this topic matters to you.
Yeah, first, good evening, y'all. Like, y'all a little too quiet for me. Like, I feed off of like a good call and response and audience, so I hope y'all a little active. But as y'all can see, I'm a speechwriter by trade. And so there are two things I do every day. I help folks tell their stories, and I help bring people together. And with Speechwriters of Color, it was founded in 2020 because we recognized a gap in the system in the area for being able to bring writers into a space to make a difference. We realized there was a lack of representation of writers who represented and wrote for leaders, and they didn't reflect the audiences that folks were trying to reach. And so we created this nonprofit with the intent in order to build more representation in the communication space and to build more representation for more effective storytelling. Because what you say influences how people act. And it's important that we have all perspectives and all backgrounds available to help tell those stories. And nuance in those stories is incredibly important as well.
Excellent. And then just why does this topic matter to you?
And so this topic matters to me because I think that we're at a very important reset point around civility, because historically civility has been used to silence the voices of marginalized folks or folks who speak up about wrongdoing that they've faced or have been impacted by. And we have a chance to really reframe the conversation of civility to focus on things that can hold folks accountable and to talk about things that matter in order to actually have true civility, where we're having honest conversations and where we're able to hold folks accountable. Because disagreement doesn't mean saying okay to dehumanization.
Yeah, go ahead. Hopefully you guys got a sense for what kind of panel we have here and the expertise at hand. Let's start with our first question. So let's dive into the problem here. What is going on with people? What are they experiencing at this time as it relates to polarization and disagreement? Kurt, why don't you start us off on this question?
Sure. So folks have always been divided. There's always been disagreement. It's worse now. It's probably no surprise to you if you've had a conversation about politics in the last few years. Some data suggests that for the first time in a long time, we dislike the other side more than we like our own side. So it used to be that we just voted for our people and then we just didn't vote for them because we love our people. But now we don't want those people, and I guess I'll vote for these people. Not a great place to be. And speaking of holiday dinners, another great study found that holiday dinners, Thanksgiving dinners with cross-partisans, it's like left and right folks, they end half an hour earlier than holiday dinners where everyone agrees. So it's like no time for pie. You know, what a terrible state of America. And I think what is really driving a lot of these things are like deep feelings of outrage at the other side, and that's what I study. You know, that's what I'm writing about today. And these feelings of outrage, kind of, if you take a step back, they come from our kind of like deepest moral convictions, and those are ultimately driven by concerns about harm. And so it doesn't matter whether you're on the left or the right, we're all concerned about protecting ourselves and our family and our society. Right, but I think the problem is now that we see harms very differently on the left and the right. So maybe, you know, millions of years ago, we all agreed what was harmful. It's like getting eaten by saber-toothed cats, right? Like we can all agree that's bad. But we don't have as many wild animals hunting us today. Instead, we disagree about kind of more perceived harms, like immigration, right? And if you're on the right, then you're worried about the harms of cartel members coming over the border and maybe killing U.S. citizens. But if you're on the left, you're worried about harming vulnerable people who are maybe separated from their family at the border. And so there's this really big divide in the kind of harms we're worried about and the threats we see. We even disagree about who's especially vulnerable to harm. So Brian Thompson, right, the CEO who was recently murdered, folks who are very progressive tend to see those in power positions as not being vulnerable to harm. Whereas folks who are more on the right, they see kind of those folks in power as being more vulnerable to harm. And so you get this really kind of divergent worldviews based on media bubbles, based on social media, and so forth.
Did not expect to hear data on the length of my Thanksgiving dinner, but thank you, Kurt, for that. Very important issues. Gabriella, you've also been kind of studying what's going on among people within the workplace. What have you seen as it relates to employee sentiment around this topic of politics and how people are feeling?
Yeah, so we've studied this by looking at employee experience sentiment around spiking political events. In particular, we've looked at around the past 3 U.S. elections, 2024, 2020, but also the midterm election in 2022. And so we look at the calendar of those events, of things like debates, of the actual election day, and how employee scores on things like well-being, productivity compare to those scores in off years and non-election years, to essentially a baseline in those same months and other years. And we've been able to quantify significant drops in both well-being and productivity for employees at work during those election weeks. We estimated translating this into absences using the Bureau of Labor Statistics data and converted it to roughly $900,000 of lost productivity per week around these spikes, particularly around elections, for about 10,000 employees. So start to add that up over the weeks because it builds up and then it recedes. It becomes quite expensive in addition to being uncomfortable. Beyond the well-being and productivity, we also see negative impacts of political tension at work on team collaboration, which would follow from everything Kurt just described. Also on mental health, on a sense of belonging, which at the end of the day is one of these things that becomes so deeply threatened when we feel politically polarized against those in our workplace, in particular our leaders or those who are in power.
Excellent. And Gabriella touched on this a little bit, but Steve, these things like conflict, avoidance, distrust among each other, how might that impact businesses and organizations and the people within them on achieving their goals?
When you get into these arguments that are very, very intense, and I want to focus on the workplace, they affect productivity, they affect safety, they affect concentration. Frankly, they are as highly charged as race, sex, religion, age, national origin, disability, sexual orientation. There's a special part about the workplace. The workplace is a place where people share commonality every day. They spend more time at work, most of us, than we do at home. You should have common mission, vision, and values, and organizations should be operationalizing them by activating those values just like they do safety. One other thing that's happening is we can tell people we don't care what you think, but we have a right to say how you behave because your behavior affects productivity and teamwork. One other thing that's happened in the last 4 years, 8 years, there are so many ways now to antagonize people and that we need to face up to it. Email, voicemail, texts, posting, you name it. And we need to have consistent standards. But the harm to organizations is significant. And I want to keep coming back to the idea that it's not just the money. Believe it or not, to many, the money is an abstraction. Do you realize that you could be causing people harm and death, mortality in whatever the organization and industry is? Do you realize that you could be affecting productivity, results, and safety? Those are the things that are being affected, and we need to treat that with the same degree of consideration that we give to safety and other forms of strict mandates about how we govern behavior, because it's the workplace. And we're trying to build better workplaces for a better world. And it's the great, perfect place to start.
Michael, along those same lines, what is your sense of how these forces are affecting different organizations as they seek to achieve their goals?
I think a big piece of it is thinking through the history of how businesses have functioned and activated for a long time. It's often been agreement in spite of harm. And so it's created a sense of peace for folks despite potential harm, but because it felt polite, folks were able to acknowledge and survive through it a bit more. And we're in this moment where now businesses, there's not going to be that peace at all because a lot of this has been muddied and brought up to the surface in terms of the disagreements that folks have. And we're seeing it in its full vision and its full view. And so while you have the business case that you can always talk about with the fiduciary duty that businesses have towards their shareholders and their stakeholders for making sure that they're the most productive and making the most money, you also have the productivity and safety piece as well, where something that comes to mind is there's a lot of news about Congresswoman Sarah McBride and the new standards in terms of bathroom usage at the Capitol. And on one hand, you may have folks who are like, let's just not talk about that. That's not going to impact our business because we might not have a trans person on our team. However, the issue is that for businesses that may have a trans person on their lobbying team who suddenly has to go to the Capitol, those new laws and those new standards impact your people that are at your company, that are a part of your organization. And suddenly you have to take into consideration, are you keeping your employees safe? Are you allowing them to be as productive as they can be, or are you adding more stress to the work that they're doing? And so you have to always understand at a macro level of what these issues are looking like, not only for your current employees, but your potential employees, for your consumers and your potential consumers as well. Because if you're not looking at all of these potential permutations and opportunities where folks are able to work alongside one another, then you risk backing down from something that could have a negative impact on your business, or you miss a moment where you could double down on your organization's values and stand out.
Excellent. So we've talked kind of at a high level about some of the broader themes at play here. Let's just, what has the last month or so been like within your own organization, within the organizations that you work with? Steve, what are you seeing leaders, caring about and dealing with at this time?
They're confused by a lot of things. How do I handle this? And honestly, I think the issue resolution, not that it's perfect, it's not, but right in front of them, any organization right now talks about respect. How many of you have values that speak to respect one way or another, or teamwork, or productivity? How many? Just raise your hands. Anybody not? Everybody does. Everybody has policies and training. Why is there a problem? The problem is we are not taking those principles and activating them, bringing them alive. And I've got to say, one tip I would give everyone here, if you're going to talk to your teams about how this impacts them, don't do it abstractly. Say to them, this is what happens to you or could in your area, not just generally, but in your area. I was telling Gabriella that years ago I had a situation where surgeons whose behavior was surgically, technically great, but they were rude and outrageously dismissive, condescending, embarrassing. People wouldn't work with them, couldn't concentrate, and anesthesiologists at times in critical cardiac surgery would not speak up. Think about that if you're on the table, or your child, or your family member, but we've got to bring the issue home with that degree of specificity in your organization.
Gabriella, how about you? What are you seeing from clients? What's kind of going on? And I know you have also been collecting some data since the end of the election. So what have you seen there?
Yeah, so 3 really interesting trends in the data that we've been following since June. The first is a divergence in well-being, depending on whether you feel like you won the election or not. So those who feel that they're happy with the results of the election had preserved or increased well-being. In some cases, that was true for those who were unhappy, but those who were unhappy with the results were more likely to have a decrease in well-being. There's about a 20% average difference in well-being scores of those unhappy with the election versus happy. So there's a real divergence in the human experience in the workplace based on those results. The second is there's a divergence between managers at all levels and frontline workers. So independent of the political views, we see that there's actually a bounce in resilience scores for managers and other leaders versus frontline, where they're reporting more of a negative impact on their mental health coming out of the election. And then the last one gets back to something Kurt mentioned in his remarks earlier about this growing divide between how we feel toward our own side versus the other side. We call it sort of in-group, out-group. So we've been measuring how warmly do I feel toward the in-group or out-group since June. And there's a divergence for sure. But coming out of the election, there was a steep decline in those feelings of warmth toward the out-group, to the point there's actually a 2x difference between where we feel warm toward the out-group versus the in-group, meaning we feel twice as warm toward our in-group as we do toward the out-group. That's just one of these measures of polarization where we can say it actually is growing in the direct aftermath of Election Day.
So, yeah, we've talked about kind of the extent to which people are disagreeing. We've talked about how it's affecting businesses, what's been going on in the world. Let's move on to talk about some solutions here. Michael, you worked with the communications firm Axios HQ to work on an election readiness guide for business leaders. I'm not going to ask you to give us the spark notes exactly per se, but give us kind of the main bullets there of what went into making this guide, why was it important, and what were the key themes of what you were trying to get across there?
Yeah, so I think the top line piece for the name of the game here is scenario planning. So like as a communications professional, you want to have a plan for all scenarios. And so with some of the clients that I worked with ahead of the elections, we had a plan in regard to each outcome and if outcomes would be undetermined. Because if we didn't know the result, then that's a whole other form of communications that you would need to have with your employees and key stakeholders. And so with this guide, Axios HQ and Speechwriters of Color partnered with one another because we knew it would be important to create a playbook and a game plan for folks to be able to follow. Because oftentimes we're seeing leaders and organizations get caught flat-footed in these conversations where they're either too stunned to speak or they end up just reacting with whatever's top of mind, rushing to get something out. And that's not going to be effective when you're trying to be credible messengers to the folks that you have a stake in talking to. And so a big piece of this conversation, a big piece of this playbook that we created was ensuring that we built a timeline and a game plan of, hey, you need to have pre-election communications, encouraging folks to be civically engaged. We don't need any partisan lean, but we need to encourage folks to utilize their own independent agency, because no matter your perspective, you have a right to participate in our democracy. And that should be encouraged by all businesses because, hey, democracy is good for business. Also, on top of that, it's important that even if you have those pre-election communications, you need to be prepared for communications on election day and after the election. What are organizations and companies doing to support participation in elections? We've seen in the past, there are organizations who have come out saying, hey, we're going to give paid time off so you can go vote, or we're going to allow that to be used for early voting, or time on election day, or time to volunteer, whatever it may be. And so making sure that there is an election day plan to show that you're a pro-democracy organization. Because again, businesses and organizations that are operating and supporting a large number of people within this country should be pro-democracy. And then finally, those post-election communications are the next piece where you evaluate the results, you evaluate what you're hearing from any transition team or the incoming leaders in terms of how they may impact your consumers or your team and their organization. And from there, there's a decision-making matrix that we included in this where there are a few key questions you could follow that determine whether or not you need to make a statement publicly, or maybe it's an internal communication, or if you need to wait and see, gather information, and find out what needs to be done, because you can't operate reactively in this environment. You have to have a standard of values and decision making that you utilize, because you have to maintain credibility. You have to show that your values are not some sort of caricature that you're just throwing up at any moment to try and justify what you want to do, but those values actually mean something, and you follow the pathway that leads to those values no matter what the impact or outcome might be.
And then just, Michael, along those lines, you mentioned in the guide that this is not, something that dies the day after Election Day, something you need to kind of keep the effort on, things you got to work on in the coming months after an election as well. How do you make this kind of a year-round effort and not, something that's seasonal every 2 or 4 years?
And so I think a big piece of that is taking away the national lens around elections, because there are always going to be ballot referendum, there are always going to be municipal elections. And at the end of the day, you want to create a culture of participation, a culture of voting, an idea that you're leaning into a value of freedom and a value of agency. Because the best thing that an organization can do is brag about the work that people that are a part of the organization are doing. And if your folks are community-driven, community-involved, and community-led, they're likely participating in things that are impacting their community. Oftentimes, that can be things that are on the ballot, or that can be civically engaging with local or municipal governments. And so being able to have that culture of participation is incredibly important, where your civic engagement efforts might not always be around voting. It might be about issue education, or it might be about things that are important to the company, or it might be surveying your employees and finding out what community issues matter most to them and where they're working. How are you giving back to the communities that you're working in and serving in? And being able to utilize that, those all fall into the same type of civic engagement and community engagement bucket that should be a part of your holistic strategic plan, especially if you're trying to maintain authentic and meaningful relationships with your consumers and your team.
Wonderful.
I want to make a comment about something.
Please.
From what I've seen, so much of the issues of division are arising at the team level, coworker level. And one of the things that organizations can do is to focus on commonalities rather than differences. If you start off by focusing on differences, it's easy to say, I have nothing in common with this person. When you work in the same organization, your livelihoods and other things are affected in a common way, and focusing on commonalities beyond that is critical to getting people to say, otherwise, I'm looking at a caricature of this human being. Years ago, when I was a first-year law student, I got to be friendly with a friend of mine. I'll just call him Warren. Warren came from an entirely different background in every way, and totally we were at opposite sides of the political spectrum, completely different. And we've stayed friends for 50 years. Now, how did that happen? Well, we both worked hard in law school, and struggled together. And we both played squash together all the time, and we'd play back and forth. I got to know him, he got to know me. And by the way, I learned something about his views that helped me, and vice versa. But if we had just seen ourselves as he's different, I'm different, we can't connect, we would have never had that. And it benefited all him and it benefited me tremendously.
Excellent. Kurt, you're actually working on a book, I believe, with the phrase common ground in the title. What can you share about kind of how to develop that feeling of common ground between people?
Yeah, so it's essential, right, to focus on what we share. And it's also essential to get rid of a misconception that many people have. So we ran a really big study asking many, many Americans, what would it take for you to respect someone on the other side? And people say, just give me the facts. I want the facts, no editorializing, give me the facts. We say, okay, here are the facts. And they say, not those facts. Those are not the right facts. And so, because of the media environment, because of how our minds work, right, facts are not compelling. Facts do not bear on morality, on politics, in the way that facts bear on what blender to buy or what car to buy, right? They're different domains. And so instead of facts, what our research finds is that we need to tell stories. We need to tell stories, especially those stories that showcase that we're concerned about harm, about vulnerability, about protecting ourselves. So let me give you an example. We ran a study where we had a research assistant on campus. She had a conversation with a passerby about guns. That passerby usually says, look, I'm pro-gun control. And she says, that's un-American. Like, how could you think that? And here's why I think your view is so un-American, right? We wanted to have lots of incivility in this experiment to see if we could dial it down. And she either said, here's why I believe that. Here's a statistic about how many times people use guns to defend themselves in America. Usually they're like, that is not a real statistic. Or she says, here's a story about how my mom used a gun to defend herself from a home invader. The conversation goes very different. Right? And it doesn't matter what issue. We can look at the YouTube comments on videos about abortion. You can look at op-eds in the New York Times. You can look at interviews in CNN and Fox News. It doesn't matter. When you tell stories, people see you as more human. They respect you more. They see you as more rational. It doesn't mean you have to discard facts. I'm a scientist. Facts are important. But just don't open with them, whether that's at work or in the Thanksgiving table. Right? Start with the story. Make folks see you as a human being. You can invite them to share their views, make them feel heard, but don't just throw facts at them. No one ever says, you know what? Oh my goodness, that fact is so good. I've changed my mind. You're right about abortion or immigration. Right? That never happens. So think about stories instead of facts.
We'll try to find that fact someday, but I too believe that facts are important. But yeah, thank you, Kurt. That's really helpful. And Gabrielle, you mentioned managers and kind of a disconnect between managers and maybe middle managers as well. What can we do on that front to kind of make people leaders better equipped to deal with everything that we're discussing today?
Yeah, so if we think about the difference in stress at work experienced by two individuals, the difference in their stress due to political tension at work, we can account for that variance in three different categories. Individual factors, their mindsets, things like optimism are actually very protective for us in a politically tense environment. Organizational factors, some of what Michael was talking about, do organizations make statements or not? Do you agree with those statements or not? And then there's leader factors, specifically my manager. And of all three of those categories, the my manager category accounts for the most variance in the differences between two individuals' experiences. So same workplace, same organization, yes, different individual mindsets. The manager is going to be the biggest determinant of whether I feel stressed about politics at work or not. And why, and what does it come down to? So in a word, it's really about how human is that manager and their ability to connect to you. Political polarization is in some ways about dehumanization. Stories, common ground, it's rehumanization. How do we find our path toward empathy and connection? So managers who are liable to increase our levels of political stress at work do things like themselves make politically charged comments. They do things like they ignore or dismiss concerns. Whereas managers who are really good at helping us feel calm, even in spiking political moments, they listen, they express empathy, they express care, they encourage the team to express care, and tactically they're also very good at problem solving. So they're confident in this moment of a manager of what needs to be done. We can point to any number of issues in the modern workforce and say, this is the manager's job. This truly is the place where the manager sets the terms of the culture. They're the face of the company. And yet, many of these managers are first-time managers, have been in the workforce a few years. It's a really tall order. So when we think about what can organizations do about this, it's really how do you enable the managers with those deeply human skills. Management today is not about delegation. It's really not about project management. We have lots of tooling that can do those things. It's about how do we coach and empower the people on our team to rise to these novel, constantly changing challenges. How do we create a big tent under which we all fit and can feel committed to our work? And how do we have that alignment of values and mission that can make the workplace actually a respite from the political tension outside of work, and can help bring people back together in a way that other institutions today are not motivated to do.
So interesting. It's really a mandate for a different style of leadership today than probably what a lot of people were trained on in the past. Steve, you've also mentioned earlier this topic of maintaining your organizational values and how to do that. I can just share from some previous work experience. Sometimes you kind of hear a mission statement and then you maybe never hear it again. It can be kind of tough to make that really ingrained in the culture. So how do you go about doing that? How do you go about making those values really something that people express?
That's a great question, and I'll try to give a short answer. Number one, if we're going to focus on political right now, the point has been made that very rarely do you change anyone's political views. And one thing I ask people to think about is why even have the conversation, because it's not going to change anyone's views. Second, if you're going to have the conversation, and that's what we're talking about, let it be known that if somebody wants to talk about it, fine. If somebody else doesn't want to, honor it and move on. Third thing that's really critical, and it actually goes to your point, I think, is there should be certain things that people understand. If you're going to have a conversation with someone about politics, there are certain things you never, ever say. Because once you say them, you cannot recover from them, maybe ever, in terms of work-life history. Just as there are things like sex, race, religion, age, whatever you're thinking about, don't say them, don't write them, don't text them, not just because of legal issues, but because you'll never, ever recover. As to what leaders need to do, they need to repeat this, and when people come to them, they need to help work it out one way or another. If you avoid the very worst, don't say the worst to you and vice versa. We should have an environment where you and I can speak up. I can say, Amon, that just kind of bugged me, or you can say it. We can work it out and get help if it's not resolved. Those are 4 or 5 simple behaviors that need to be consistently made part of culture. When I speak to organizations, they'll all raise their hands. We have values, we have mission, all of these things in policies. And the question I'll ask them is, well, why are you here then? Why? They're here because they're words. They haven't been activated to change and build a culture that reflects those values.
And Michael, do you have anything to add on kind of the communications front on that, on how you kind of can make cultural values present across the organization?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of, like I always say a phrase like leaders have to lead, like leaders lead, and you have to have that courage to lead. And so my grandma always told me, treat others the way you want to be treated. And like it's a very basic value. And leaders don't have to try and show up in this appearance of what they think a leader should look like, but they need to show up authentically. And showing up authentically can end up leading to a leader living the values that they're supposed to represent as a part of an organization. And so oftentimes it really is being a good storyteller, like Kurt mentioned, because it's those stories that build those bridges of conversation. And something that I think about often is there's a very fun friendship in Congress that has been covered a little bit, but folks don't talk about it often. But it's the fact that Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Congressman Tim Burchett of Tennessee are like pretty good friends, like they get along pretty well. Yet they are polar opposites completely, don't agree on anything, and like will often go at each other too in terms of their political beliefs. But there might be a video that Congressman Burchett is filming leaving the Capitol and sees her and is like, have a great weekend, Cortez. And it's like, I know for some folks that's bringing them back to like, see, this is the golden age of civility that we love and we want to come back. However, that doesn't mean that like that should be the perfect standard that we're going back to, but it shows that there is an opportunity to be respectful with folks that you share space with, even if you disagree with them. And for me, as someone who I grew up in a very diverse political household with my family, where like we had independents, we had libertarians, we had Democrats, we had everyone of all walks of life under one roof, you know? And through that, you know, we're watching the Thursday night football game on Thanksgiving. We're able to make it all the way through dinner. But it's because we might get as heated as can be over our thoughts on politics, but you have that shared value of, hey, this is someone that's engaging with me in good faith to a degree. And I think that's the root of what these conversations have to have, is engaging in good faith. And we also have to have the courage to recognize when folks are not engaging in good faith, and know that we have to take a step to double down on our values rather than try and compromise ourselves and engage in the best faith possible when someone's not reciprocating that for us either.
Yeah. I think that's such a great point, and I think you can do that better maybe when you've engaged to understand instead of win. So I took an Uber to the airport a little while ago, and the Uber driver said he's a Christian nationalist, but not the kind you typically think of. I don't typically think of Christian nationalists, so it was a half an hour cab ride, and so I said, please tell me about what you think, right? I was trying to understand, that was my goal. And so he tells me about what he believes, definitely not what I believe, right? But he's really laying out there like how he differs from libertarians, how he differs from other Christian nationalists. And then as we get to the airport, we start having conversation about abortion because it wasn't contentious enough. And then he says, well, anyone who is pro-choice, I think you need to start thinking about like the Gestapo and like death camps. And as soon as someone starts comparing someone to Hitler, it's like game over, right? Maybe a thing you can't take back. But because I listened to understand him, I said, whoa, you cannot compare people, like half of the country, to Hitler. That is not acceptable. And when I teach debate to students, and he says, you know what, you're right. I take it back. I didn't mean it like that. It's just hard to express my views, but thank you for listening. So you can double down, but only if you have this like base of respect and understanding.
By communicating.
Yeah, exactly, by communicating, for sure.
Well, you should not have made me laugh on this panel here, but that's good stuff, Kurt. Thank you. So we've got about 2.5 minutes left here. Why don't we just end with a quick, let's try and make this as useful as possible for the business leaders in the room. Just a 30-second, what's your final piece of advice on what to do or not to do for business leaders on managing politics at work? We'll start with you, Steve.
Key rule I've said is if you're not willing to listen, you have nothing to say. And conversations should be mutual, and they should be respectful behaviorally, and that should be laid out. And it should be seen as serious as any other kind of behavioral issue that could otherwise divide, fracture, and cause organizational harm.
Gabrielle?
Okay, I've got two.
Go for it.
So the first is collect data. This is a business issue like any other issue, a workforce issue like any other issue. We should be making data-driven decisions. Collect data on how people are experiencing it, collect data on their preferences. We've collected data on employee preferences around how they want their organizations to respond, whether or not they want them to make statements, et cetera. It's been eye-opening to the partners we've shared it with, to the point that they realize in some cases they've spent way too much time and money on the wrong things. So collect that data. You can get data from Kurt's lab, from our lab, from lots of labs and organizations that are out there. Know that there's still more data to be collected, but make an evidence-based decision, just like you would with any other business challenge. The second is practice centered leadership. So centered leaders respond, they don't react. They take their time to access wisdom, to make decisions and lead in ways that inspire confidence, that inspire a sense of being seen, a sense of care and empathy across the team. It trickles down, it matters for your employees, it matters for their well-being, for their health, and for what they're bringing home. And in a culture where so many forces want to increase political polarization and accelerate the increase in both affective and ideological polarization that we're seeing, it is an opportunity for organizations to actually bring people together and be a force for connectedness that we really need in this country.
Kurt?
I'll be quick. In conversations, if you're trying to win, then you've already lost.
Excellent. Michael, take us home.
You don't want to back down on your values, double down. As a leader in a successful organization, you need to double down on what works. Follow the data, follow your values, and take action that makes sense for your business. Don't compromise yourself just because you want to rapidly respond to whatever's in the news.
Excellent. Well, that's going to do it for our panel. Thank you. That's all for my questions in this portion of the evening, but we do have the Q&A beginning, so folks in the room, if you do have questions, this is the time. We're going to have someone with a microphone going around, so if anyone would like to ask, please feel free.
Yeah, if you want to stand up. Hi, my name is Sarah Johnson. I'm the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for U.S. Renal Care. And my question is to you. When you talked about starting with commonalities, there's also perspective that if you don't acknowledge we're different, you're really not seeing me. How do you bridge that?
Can I speak to that?
Yes.
Typically, I think people initially bond on commonalities. When you see those commonalities, it gives you an opportunity to respect differences, but recognizing the things that you share. You have to do it. Sometimes I believe that when we start by differences, we never get to the point of recognizing that person may have a different background, but my gosh, there's everything that we share is the same. It's amazing. And that's why I'm speaking about that. I think they both need to be addressed. It's how you approach it for most impact. Last.
Anyone else want to add to that answer?
I would just say that true connection, the kind of connection that improves our well-being and makes us nourished and thrive, relies on authenticity. And so anything else it's just superficial. And if there's a connection where someone doesn't feel seen for who they are, it's not really achieving this idea of humanization and common ground. So I think your point's very well taken.
Yeah, I would add to find commonalities and values, because if you can find at least shared values, then that's cool. Everything else can be as different as can be, because you don't want to be in super homogenous spaces. That can be boring if you're just with twins of yourself,
Any other questions from the group? Yes, right there.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Christelle Desnoyer. I'm Chief of Staff at Kyndryl. Thank you, Aman, for inviting me. I actually understood the topic of this event differently, given that I'm a Chief of Staff, so politics. I actually thought we would talk about politics at work, not the politics like Democrat, etc., which is very relevant to my role. However, I think this panel is incredibly interesting, given that I speak funny, as you can hear me, but I also happen to be French. You can't hear that. Debating in France on politics is like second nature. And that's what's really interesting living in this country for 14 years. I'm now American. I voted for the first time this year. And so, thank you. And so all these conversations on a personal front were really interesting in that, I can't talk about politics the same way that I do back growing up at the dinner table, not during Thanksgiving, but we would have 6-hour lunches and dinners, and we would talk about politics all the time. And having civility on that is very, very different than the US, where there is that outrage. The word outrage was used on the panel. And in America, it's very different. It's a lot more emotional. It's really attached to your core values, as opposed to just being, oh, you think different, cool. You like red, I like blue, fine, right? That's not the case here. And so talking about it at work, and obviously the abortion was mentioned also as a chief of staff, like we had to react to it, especially 50% of the workplace are women. I work for a female CEO. So my question to you is, on top of the US culture, how do you think about all the internationals being in New York City and having I think we speak 186 languages in New York City? And so we talk about politics in the US lens, but we have a lot of foreigners as well that are still living here, paying taxes here, and going through the political system that cannot vote. How do you address that in the workplace specifically? And I know it's a very niche question, but at the same time, I just wanted to represent that voice.
Would anyone like to tackle that one?
I'll say a quick thing. I want to defend America maybe a little bit. I'm an immigrant as well. I was born and raised in Canada and voted a little while ago. I became a citizen on the day my daughter was born. The guys were like, it's cool, don't worry about it. Your wife will be in labor a long time. It was not cool, it turns out. But I do think there's hot button issues everywhere, right? So if you think about increasing the retirement age from 62 to 64, right, that was a big moment in France as well, right? And it seemed like that was an emotional outpouring. I do think that there are specific structures, like a two-party system, particular primaries, that really exacerbate differences. And I think maybe a kind of global trend is more like social media, right, that like really foments this outrage. And at work too, right? When I talk to folks, they're like, once my team gets on social media, it's game over. But I just wanted to stand up for, our adopted country a little bit, even if there's definitely problems. But yeah.
Yeah, I would even add to that, I have the privilege to work with some organizations that do work globally as well. And this past year was a year that had the most elections like worldwide ever compared to other years. Like there were more people casting votes across the globe than anywhere before. And seeing the different impacts from disinformation and misinformation to how folks are participating, I think one way that kind of shifts the different perspectives is the idea of like politics is more gamesmanship rather than the traditional political view of who gets what, when, and how. And like I think at least in the United States, folks tend to really embrace like the impact of an election is determining like what I'm getting, when I'm getting it, how I'm getting it. And sometimes like that what, when, and how can be as deep as rights to money in the pocket that folks are getting. And so it ends up hitting very personally. However, I also will say that I definitely agree that there's a broader like centering of American exceptionalism that we often think about, where we end up overlooking some of the potential global impact, where there was actually a post during the election where I think it was actually someone from France too, who was like, why should I know what Maricopa County, Arizona is? And it's pieces like that where we're getting so in the nitty-gritty domestically here that we sometimes are missing the broader global view and global praxis of the impacts of how serious the stakes are in our elections as well.
I'll add one comment, and I did have trouble with hearing through the microphone, I think, but as I understand it, you were talking about your French heritage. Things are different there as opposed to here. We've worked globally in our work for a long time. And I can remember one experience when some comments were made, not about politics, they were about gender, and they were inappropriate comments. And somebody in the US said I would be fired. Somebody in Canada said, or I'd be sued. Somebody in Canada at that time said I'd be fired. And frankly, there was a comment from somebody in France who said, what's the problem with that? The problem is, though, and how you solved it is there were different global cultures, but these organizations that have done this, that we've worked with, say, wherever you are, we're going to set standards of behavior. in our workplace that are ours and your organizational citizens bound by those standards of behavior because you work here. I'm just stressing that because we're here, and thanks to SHRM, better workplaces, better world. And having common standards that you apply can have an impact to the kinds of behaviors we've been talking about.
Wonderful. Other questions from the crowd?
You have one person there.
Yeah, hi. So I'm David Yakubovich. I'm from the Medical Society of the State of New York. So as far as advice, given, I kind of look both sides, kind of like trying to pick up the clean end of a turd. And the question becomes is, if you want to just basically advance your organization and not fall into the pitfalls of one side versus the other, what are some good techniques if you can find out like what would advance the organization without them necessarily looking at a partisan lens?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that to start. So we, as I mentioned, we were able to track dips in well-being and productivity for organizations around various elections, both present and historically. We're also able to look at which organizations were protected from that. So there were three really important features of those organizations that saw less of a distraction from the elections, less of a dip in productivity and in well-being. The first was that they invested heavily in employee development. So how do we understand that? If I have a place at work to invest myself, to feel like I'm growing, I have an identity there, I have something I care about in that place that has a separation from everything else around me. I have a momentum. The organization's giving me a sense of momentum. It's going to be harder to distract me. Similarly, organizations that ranked very high in their celebration, recognition, and incentivization of collaboration, so places where it is rewarded, recognized to be rowing in that boat together, it's harder to tip that boat over if everybody is rowing in that together. So everyone has clarity on what we're working on and why. And we know that it's important to the organization that we are supporting one another. The last was actually how well those organizations are able to entrain some of those skills I talked about, listening, empathy, under the category of how do we entrain coaching skills? How do we entrain the ability to listen for understanding rather than for response, as Kurt said, to be connected to another human being through the human experience. Maybe election day was horrible for two people on your team for totally opposite reasons. They have in common they had a really bad day. So how do we find those capabilities and entrain them for leaders today in replacement of a different model of leadership? Investing in those three things were protective against those disruptions in well-being and productivity, keeping the organization focused.
Maybe I'll add to that in saying that the intuition of like advancing the organization despite kind of political disagreement, I think, is wise. There's some data suggesting that people dislike when organizations take political stances, and we can leave aside the kind of like normative ethical quandary of like, should you endorse particular values? But it turns out that if an organization takes a stance on a particular value, people who agree with that are like, yeah, of course you did, that's the right thing. And then the people who are on the other side are like, that's terrible and I can never trust this organization again. So you don't really gain from people who agree with you, but you really do lose with people who disagree. And so it's a tough thing to do.
Time for one more question, I think.
Hi. I'd like to bring Orwell into this. Okay. So my point is, who basically has time for this, for the politics at work? So in other words, many jobs today are metered. It's not necessarily 9 to 5, you're clocking in based on the per minute and everything. And if your job is to count chickens on the monitor, chickens hatched on the monitor, and you're talking to the person in the cubicle next to you, well, where Orwell would come in would be a combination of computer vision and AI, where someone above is determining that. So the basic point is, isn't it a luxury to do this at work? Or maybe not now, but in the future it'll be even more of a luxury.
I think a lot of things would change when we live in the panopticon. It's a very fair point. But I think even if we're governed by AI, people think of AI as human beings and have to make sense of it. So I think no matter who we're interacting with, we project minds onto them. Minds have political views, and we have to still navigate that messy tension when it comes to our interactions.
I'll make a slightly more meta point. So us being here today in this forum devoted to workplaces, in part is a product of a world where knowledge work is how so much value is created. Knowledge work happens in collaboration between people, which is a different form of value creation than you're talking about. And when we have conflict, when we disagree, when we dehumanize the other, it interferes with work that hinges on interpersonal collaboration. So I think it's probably fundamentally a different kind of work than what you're describing that creates a forum for us to talk about this tonight.
All right. Well, that is going to do it for the panel portion of this evening. How about a round of applause for our panelists? All right, now let's welcome to the stage Jennifer Cunningham, Newsweek's executive editor, to introduce our 2024 winners of the Newsweek Stubblefield Civility Awards.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Let's give it up one more time for our esteemed panel. Very informative panel. So tonight, I'm thrilled to talk about something that is very close to my heart, civility in our society. It's a topic that often feels elusive in our fast-paced, high-stakes world, but it's really important now more than ever. I want you to imagine a world where our elected officials, regardless of their political affiliation, engage in respectful dialogue, listen actively to each other, and work collaboratively for the common good. That is the vision behind the Newsweek Stubblefield Institute Civility Awards. Civility isn't about diluting our beliefs or avoiding conflict. It's about disagreeing without disrespect, debating without demeaning, and engaging without enmity. It's about finding common ground and fostering an environment where constructive conversations can flourish. The Civility Awards recognize federal elected officials, heads of businesses, nonprofits, and community leaders who exemplify these values. These awards celebrate those who have shown that it's possible to be firm in your convictions while still being courteous, respectful, and open-minded. Let's take a moment to appreciate the hard work and dedication of these outstanding honorees. They are the shining beacons of hope, proving that respect and kindness can coexist with passionate advocacy. Their efforts inspire us all to be better listeners, better collaborators, and ultimately, better citizens. As we celebrate these remarkable individuals, I want to challenge each of us to reflect on our own interactions. How can we incorporate more civility in our own daily lives? How can we promote a culture of respect and understanding in our communities? And remember, change starts with us, and even the smallest act of kindness can create a ripple effect. I want to give a special thank you and a shout out to Ashley Horst, Executive Director of the Stubblefield Institute, and Scott Widmeyer, Co-Chair of the Board of Directors of Stubblefield. Please stand and be recognized. Thank you for being our partners in this worthy endeavor. I also want to say thank you to the Newsweek team, Dan Bush, our White House correspondent, Richard Frisch, our special advisor, Chief of Strategy, Diane Kandapa, Chief of Staff, Ryan Kinney, and our Global Editor-in-Chief, Nancy Cooper. In closing, I just want to thank you all for being here today and for supporting the Civility Awards. I want us all to continue to champion respect, empathy, and collaboration in all of our endeavors, and together we can make a more harmonious and productive society. Thank you again. So without further ado, please see our video of our esteemed honorees. Thank you.
If we want people to have confidence in our democracy, we need to show them that we can work together to get things done for them.
There are problems that are going to require unity in this country to really seek the solutions.
People need to respect one another, have a civil conversation, and that will bring us back to the civility.
You pretty much need some sort of buy-in from the other side to achieve almost anything.
If there's something that I try to live by here in the Senate, it's to put myself in the shoes of my colleagues, to listen to them.
The 2024 Newsweek Stubblefield Institute Civility Awards bring national attention to the need for civility in politics and collaboration in government, business, and community.
Civility and responsible discussion on issues is very important in these really perilous and fast-moving times.
I've always believed that you don't have to agree with someone on everything in order to work with them. I've learned the importance of finding common ground rather than focusing on our differences.
We believe that voters are smart enough to make up their own mind about who's right and who's wrong, what policy is good, what policy is not good.
Those challenging times is to actually sit together. If we don't have respect to one another, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat member, so I really focus on building friendship and relationship.
We can give hope to those Americans who think that our best days are behind us instead of ahead of us.
Respect, relate, cooperate. That's pluralism. And that is the solution to our current challenges of prejudice and polarization.
Democracy requires a commitment to rule of law, a peaceful transfer of power, free and fair elections, and accountable government. A civil discourse underlies all of that.
Disagreeing better is not simply about promoting civility. It's about healthy discourse. As we learn to disagree better, we create an environment in which political literacy and kindness can thrive.
So thank you for this award and a chance to talk for a minute about why it's important to see the world from the perspectives of our colleagues, our competitors, and our friends.
It is an honor for the Stubblefield Institute and Newsweek to celebrate the individuals and organizations who work every day to foster good faith debate and bridge cultural and political divides.
Thank you for attending this evening. Please join us and our sponsors SHRM for cocktails, conversations, and live music. Visit the display wall to receive your congratulatory Newsweek cover, recognizing your company for creating a better workplace and a better world, courtesy of our sponsor SHRM.